So runner 7, I think, is the least economical. He's using around 57 mils per kilogram per minute of oxygen. And runner 4 is the most economical, and he's only using about 47 mils per kilogram per minute. Incidentally, runner 4 was me. And these data were collected during my PhD around 20 years ago now. But the reason I got into exercise physiology, and particularly the physiology of distance running, is because I used to be a bit of a runner myself, and hence that's what fueled my interest in the physiological determinants of performance. When we take VO2 max and running economy together, this is where things start to become interesting. So what we have here is two individuals, and they have exactly the same VO2 max value of 70 mils per kilogram per minute. We've got the red runner, and we've got the blue runner. Now, if we'd only measured their VO2 max, they'd have exactly the same number, 70. We think that's great, but we wouldn't know which of them was the best. However, if we do some submaximal exercise as well and measure the oxygen uptake at a series of different submaximal running speeds, and we take it to exhaustion so we can measure their max, we can see here that the blue runner is much more economical than the red runner. So if we take a speed of 16 kilometers per hour just for convenience, the blue runner is only using 50 mils per kilogram per minute, whereas the red runner is 10% less economical because he's using 55 mils per kilogram per minute. Now, when we extrapolate these VO2 to running speed relationships to maximum effort, to the VO2 max, you can see that the VO2 max translates into very different running speeds. So if both of those runners were running at their VO2 max, the blue runner would be going 1 kilometre per hour faster than the red runner. Okay, so even though their VO2 max is the same, this individual is much more economical, and when we combine the running economy with the VO2 max, you can see that the running speed or velocity at VO2 max is substantially faster. So this is the person you'd have your money on in a race. What about the fractional utilisation of VO2 max? So this is the percentage of your VO2 max that you can sustain through a given distance. It's associated with the accumulation of lactate in the blood and associated changes in pulmonary gas exchange and perception of effort. And of course there's a plethora of terms for lactate accumulation in the literature. Lactate threshold and lactate turn point are two of the terms that we use within UK athletics. But you hear the terms obler, anaerobic threshold, aerobic threshold, LT2 and so forth. But we won't confuse that for now. We're going to be talking about lactate threshold and lactate turn point. I should say, by the way, that while lactate was believed to be the principal agent in causing muscle fatigue, it's much less clear that that's the case nowadays. But nevertheless, changes in lactate do correlate well with changes in performance. So it's a really handy tool for physiologists, coach and athlete as well. We know that blood lactate concentration is very sensitive to endurance training, and it's a useful tool for us to measure. We have these portable analyzers now which make it very easy for us to measure blood lactate concentration, not only in the laboratory, but also in the field as well. And I've said already that these various lactate-related variables are highly correlated with performance. So here's a typical blood lactate concentration response to incremental exercise. Here's running speed. Here's blood lactate concentration, and that's these two curves here. And this is heart rate on the second y-axis, which is here. And this is simply a representation of what might happen following a period of endurance training in an athlete. So what we do, by the way, in our protocols is we have our runners do 3-minute stages at each of these different speeds. And the starting speed will vary according to the athlete's abilities and age and event specialism and so forth. But 14 to 16 kilometres per hour isn't far off where we would usually begin. But let's take the orange curve first. This individual started the test at 14 kilometres per hour, ran for 3 minutes. 3 minutes at 15, 3 minutes at 16, and you can see here at 16, lactate is still at the baseline value of around 1 millimolar, but after that it starts to increase. So this is the lactate threshold. Faster speed it goes up a bit, faster speed it goes up a bit more, faster again and it's starting to accelerate away much more rapidly. So we can see these 3 distinct phases: below lactate threshold, between lactate threshold and lactate turn point, and then above lactate turn point. And what we see following a period of successful endurance training is this typical rightward and downward shift of the lactate curve. So we go from the orange, maybe to 10 or 12 weeks later, to the blue. And you can see here that the lactate threshold has moved across to a higher speed, the lactate turn point has moved across to a higher speed, and generally speaking, at any one of these speeds, blood lactate concentration is lower. So you'd therefore expect the athlete to be able to sustain exercise for much longer at that intensity before they become fatigued. We have this corresponding reduction in heart rate at each of these speeds as well, suggesting there's been a cardiovascular as well as a muscle metabolic adaptation to the period of endurance training that's occurred. So the endurance test protocol that we've used now for 15 to 20 years, and which stemmed from a lot of the work I did some time ago, looks a bit like this. We measure height, body mass and body composition. All of those may be relevant to success in different events. We measure hemoglobin concentration because we know that oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is going to be important in not limiting factors such as VO2 max. And I know that Tom Rowland is speaking tomorrow morning upon iron status, both in young athletes and older athletes, so that may well be worth a listen. We do some static and dynamic measures of lung function. Essentially, we're trying to break down the athlete's physiology into its various constituent parts to try to find weaknesses that we may be able to correct. We can measure flexibility, albeit relatively crudely. We can measure leg power, if we so wish. But typically, of course, if we want to know about runners, we want them to be running. We want to measure things that they do while they run. And a treadmill test, similar to the one I've just described, is what we do. We have athletes run for between 6 and 9 stages, typically 1 kilometre per hour increments between stages, sometimes smaller increments, maybe half a kilometre per hour, if we really want to nail down exactly where the lactate threshold and lactate turn point are. Each of the stages is 3 minutes, and they start easy and end hard, and the treadmill gradient is always set at 1%, and the reason for that is that we know that if you run indoors on a flat, completely flat treadmill, that the energy cost will be less than if you run outdoors. The reason being that you don't have any air resistance to overcome if you're running indoors compared to outdoors. And through an experiment that we published back in 1996, we showed that if you set the treadmill gradient at 1%, then you can equilibrate the heart rate, VO2 and lactate responses while you run in the laboratory on a treadmill for a given speed, and that's readily transferable to predicting performance and prescribing training during exercise outdoors if you're running on a track or the road. Throughout the test, we measure oxygen uptake, we measure heart rate by telemetry, we measure blood lactate concentration at the end of each of the 3-minute stages. We have a brief pause in proceedings, 10 or 15 seconds while we take a blood sample, and then the athlete resumes running at the higher speed. And making these measurements allows us to determine the VO2 max, the running economy, and of course the blood lactate and heart rate profiles. So essentially within a 25-minute test, we can measure, with reasonable accuracy we believe, virtually all of the parameters that are really important for success in endurance running. That enables us to produce some training zones which we believe are helpful for coaches in prescribing optimal training to produce physiological adaptation. So in our terminology, again here's the lactate curve, so there's the lactate threshold, there's the lactate turn point. We have a heart rate that corresponds to that lactate threshold, we have a heart rate that corresponds to the lactate turn point, and we define running that's done below the lactate threshold as easy. We define running that's done between the lactate threshold and the lactate turn point as steady. We define running above the lactate turn point if it's sustained, just above the lactate turn point, if it's sustained for 20 to 40 minutes as tempo. And then we have aerobic interval work up here where the end exercise or end repetition heart rate will be close to the maximal heart rate. And this is for the development of VO2 max. The reason that we do this, if we have people run, say, for a 30-minute continuous running session below the lactate threshold, their blood lactate concentration remains very close to baseline values, around 1 millimolar. If we exercise them in this region here and measure their lactate every 5 minutes, let's say during a half an hour continuous run, we'll find that lactate goes up, maybe to 3 or 4 millimolar, depends on the individual, but eventually it will stabilise. So it will be elevated but stable over time. If we exercise people above the lactate threshold speed, however, for 30 minutes and look at the blood lactate profile,